Early last month, a massive barge sunk off the coast of Northeast Florida, and it was no accident. The vessel joins a few others as part of an ongoing artificial reef creation effort. To talk about it, I'm joined by Joe Kistel, a visual media producer specializing in underwater cinematography and maker of many of these reefs.
That's right.
Thanks for being here, Joe.
Thank you for the opportunity.
We're also joined by Dr. Quinton White, executive director of the Marine Research Institute and professor of biology and marine science at Jacksonville University for a little bit longer.
I'll make a minor correction. It's a former executive director. I'm retiring August 31st, and Brian Franks is now taking over the executive director position. So I'm on the cruising part of my career. So
Short timer. Well, thanks for being here, Dr. White. Joe, you've been at this for a while. You are involved in basically sinking ships, massive ships, barges offshore. How'd you get started in this line of work?
Kind of by accident. I went to University of North Florida, and I had an interest in scuba diving. When I was a young child, I grew up fishing and scuba diving in South Florida. I was kind of introduced to artificial reefs down there. So I started an appreciation. At the time, I didn't know how they got there. I just knew they were fishing at diving locations. So when I was up here in Jacksonville, I started diving with a local dive group, and then came across this opportunity where I heard that there was a vessel that was available maybe for sinking. And so I just assumed somebody was dealing with that. And I got into the project and learned real quick that this vessel was almost no longer an opportunity. And I was like, well, hey, let's make this happen. It could be a good thing. But I just assumed that there was organizations, either the county or other groups that were dealing with it. And what I found out, long story short, is that there were multiple organizations somewhat interested, but they all assumed the other organization was doing the project. So we got through that project, and at the time realized there really wasn't a central organization to deal with that. So we formed an organization called TSIRI to kind of spearhead these types of marine habitat creation projects.
And remind us what TSIRI stands for.
TSIRI stands for Think It, Sink It, Reef It.
And so the benefits of reef creation, Dr. White, I mean, Joe talks about scuba diving. Obviously, that's, a tourism attraction and an economic benefit of its own kind. But from a marine standpoint, what do these reefs bring to the marine environment? And how is this not just like pollution in the ocean?
yeah, well, offshore Jacksonville, we have sort of two kinds of bottoms, if you would, what we call live bottom and dead bottom. The live bottom is hard surfaces, rocky outcroppings, things like that. And they hold fish because they've got food, they've got resources. There's also a large amount of sand bottom out there, soft bottom, that doesn't tend to be quite as productive biologically. And we learned back, frankly, during the war, World War II primarily, that when planes or ships went down, that they quickly managed to acquire growth. We call it fouling communities because it was barnacles and bryozoans and crabs and worms and things like that. And that's food for the fish. And began to realize that we can actually enhance the fishing offshore Jacksonville if we created these artificial reefs. So this has been done for quite literally centuries, back to the Chinese and Japanese who started doing it years and years ago. And so we have done that primarily through volunteer effort. I got involved when I first got to Jacksonville back in the 70s, and then other friends of Joe's and mine have sort of carried it on, but it's always been done by volunteers. It's too bad we don't really have a government program here in the county to do it.
I was thinking about what it would take to coordinate this effort. I was kind of joking that Joe must be incredibly organized to pull it all together. But I mean, from a regulatory standpoint, from a, funding standpoint, I mean, I'm not sure which of you wants to take this, but it seems like there must be an enormous amount of agencies and participants and stakeholders that have to be involved.
Yeah, so I approach it from kind of a bias side. I'm personally aware of the benefits of these, and not everybody is, but I at least personally feel that it is worthwhile to do whatever we can to make marine habitat locations. And so my aim is to kind of just do whatever it takes, facilitate wherever. And there's a lot of pieces to that. There's regulatory, there's certain rules on what we can use, what sort of condition it has to be in, and where it can go. Just to deal with that is several steps. We got to pick a location. Is it permitted? Do we have to pull a permit? There's all these different things to pull a permit. We have to find acceptable material. Generally, my approach is to find something we can recycle. So this way we're not utilizing any resources to make something new. We're going to take something and recycle it in maybe a not traditional way that the material could potentially normally be recycled. Then if we find all that stuff, if we get the okay and the regulatory, we still have logistics. If it's generally these materials are heavy. It's either an old vessel and or it's concrete. Well, both are heavy and they're hard to transport. So there's usually cost and those types of things. So there's definitely a lot of pieces. There's a lot of red tape, and it takes a long time. But from my personal standpoint, when we see these projects after they've been in the water a few years, it's funny. Every time I start one, I'm like, I'm never doing this again because it is a nightmare to try to pull this off. But when you go dive it a couple years later and you see what it turns into, it's so gratifying to see that this underwater oasis that's created simply by, it's not simple, by placing something that potentially could have been trash otherwise.
And you do have to go through a fairly rigorous process to prepare a vessel in terms of removing things like the fluids and the electronics and anything that could be a contamination. It basically has to be just a metal husk.
Yeah, and that's a simple way to look at it. Essentially, our kind of approach is if it's not metal, we take it out. And we just sunk this barge in May. The nice thing about the barge is the barge was never self-propelled. It never had a engine or anything like that. So in this case, it was relatively clean, no fuels or anything like that. On a traditional vessel, like an old tugboat we sunk in 2000 or 2021, that had an engine, that had oil and all that. So that's a much more cumbersome process. All the fluids have to come out. And things you don't think about, like wire, like boats like that have like miles of wire in it, and they have insulation that potentially is hazardous. We take all that out, and essentially, yeah, you're left with a bare husk before it goes out.
So where does the funding come? I mean, it must be enormously expensive.
It can be, and we have to be incredibly creative, and Quint kind of hinted at it. We're always trying to county support to do these things. And unfortunately, at a local Duval County and other local Northeast Florida counties, we haven't had much support fiscally. So we have to get creative. A lot of the projects that have been done locally have been done with a lot of in-kind. So in this case, the barge was kind of provided by a company called Mobo Marine. We came up with a little bit of money for transport and some overhead, but most of our projects are like that, where we'll find something, maybe whoever has the material will provide it or help with transport. Maybe we get some help on the offshore transportation. Some local groups may help with a little bit of fiscal contribution here and there, but it's always very tough. And I mentioned to you in an email that we've done probably about 10 offshore projects over the last 10 to 13 years or so. And we're proud of those projects, but if you compare the numbers that we've done versus other counties, I'll use Daytona as an example. Daytona's probably done 150 artificial reefs in the same time period alone, and it's primarily because they have resources dedicated to those programs from the county level, where we just don't have that here.
Yeah, locally we rely on finding primarily state funding and donations from other corporations. But this is really where it'd be nice if the county stepped up and the city stepped up to provide some funding and some control, because, as you mentioned, Joe's done a great job of coordinating all the permitting and all this kind of stuff. It's not a simple process.
So he's talking about the number of projects that he's seen over the last 13 or so years. But if we could peel back the ocean, I mean, what would we see in terms of the total picture of what's been placed basically off the First Coast area?
Well, part of the problem is that nature is a very unforgiving environment, and so if you put something down 20 years ago, it's probably not there anymore because it erodes, it corrodes, it goes away in other ways. And so it takes sort of a continual process to maintain these and keep it going. And so that's why it's necessary to do it again and again and again. We have very, very good offshore fishing in Jacksonville. Much of that is due to people that did this literally in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And we've been lucky that Joe sort of picked up the gauntlet here and continued doing this locally, but he could use some help.
There is an element not just of when they degrade, but also maintaining these reefs. You had mentioned that you put them down, they do draw fishermen, for instance, and that can create a problem of its own. So explain what that looks like and how you and others that you work with try to prevent that from becoming a pollution problem.
Sure. So we really need to think of a reef as an offshore destination. That's what it is. It's similar in regards to usage as, say, something like our football stadium. Anything that's on land that's a public destination has some sort of maintenance program, obviously so. So if you went to a football game and there was no maintenance crew that came afterwards, it would be filthy. And so a byproduct of people using something is leftovers of whatever it is. What happens in the case of artificial reefs, natural reefs, anywhere that people go fishing in or diving, is it's not like you have people out there necessarily throwing trash in the water. Our fishermen are pretty respectable, the ones I know at least, and they don't do things like that. What does happen is when you fish, you may catch a fish and you get snagged on the reef, and so a little bit of line will break off. That's not a big deal. It's 5-10 feet of line. The problem is that's happened as long as boats have been able to get out there. So in some cases, 30, 40 years, we have accumulation of 10 feet of line, 10 feet of line, 10 feet of line every weekend. And so we end up with miles and miles and miles of fishing line on some of these structures. And that's generally not a good thing. It's an entanglement hazard and those kind of things. So in addition to creating reefs, what we try to propose to the county when we're getting more support for this kind of thing is we need to look at resources to create reefs, resources to also maintain our reefs, and actually resources to do outreach for things like these are the reefs we have, these are why they're important, these are why we need to maintain them. And effectively, it requires the logistics is people going down and removing this stuff. And it's not too hard. You got to be a competent diver to do so, but you just kind of cut the line and bring it up. And the good news is you can reverse 30 years of accumulation in maybe 1 or 2 dives. So it's very effective.
And so is that something that's regularly scheduled or just kind of on an as-needed basis if you're down there and you see that it's getting a little bit polluted?
It is needed. We've done it kind of voluntarily occasionally when we can. I was just talking to a dive operator yesterday. We're trying to schedule some stuff this summer. There's no county structure or anything. It's just us doing it because we dive and we know. And like I said, we can be very effective with just a handful of divers on each dive site. The problem is there's a lot of sites. And so, it's great. Everyone we do is great, but really it needs to be scaled up and to be as effective as it can be.
Yeah, this is largely a volunteer effort by sometimes scuba clubs and organizations, people who have sort of banded together and do it periodically, but there's no organized effort. And that's where I think some county assistance could come in trying to organize these kinds of things.
And there have been some creations in the river as well. Is that true?
That's right. We've actually put 2 reefs in the river, and they were pretty successful. And we'd like to look for some additional sites. In fact, we've begun doing that already. One of the things we learned about the 2 reefs in the river, which were off of San Marco, just south of the Fuller Warren Bridge, was that we needed to be closer to the mouth with higher salinity. And the trick there is you've got to find a bottom that will support it, because you cannot put it in a soft mud bottom. It'll sink into the mud. And you cannot put it too shallow because you don't want it to be a navigation hazard. So trying to find a spot is really, really hard. And I've spent a fair amount of time just staring at maps trying to figure out where we might be able to do something, and going out and sampling with some people trying to figure out what we might be able to do.
And Joe, we should say that you film extensively these sinkings. You put cameras all over the place, then, kind of create a video of the entire process. This barge sinking, we have a link to it on our website and on our social media, so people can check it out. But it's got 300,000 views already, and it really is quite a spectacle.
Yeah, it's and a big part of my background is kind of outreach, and I'm obviously biasedly passionate about what we do. So I think it's just as important to get the message out as to build a reef itself. So I at least personally take every effort I can to document the projects and to try to showcase them in a way that's engaging and to educate at the same time. So what's neat when we do something like a vessel is it provides an opportunity for sync camera footage, and it's a kind of a neat, engaging way to get people interested. Because even if you don't know anything about, say, artificial reefs or even marine conservation, a lot of times the average person may see that type of footage, and it will get them to become more engaged with the video, and then hopefully get a little bit educated, and then maybe be a little bit more conservation-minded down the road.
Well, Joe Kistel, Dr. Quint White, thank you both so much for being here and talking about this really neat projects.
It's pretty cool.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.